The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Returning from the region of Tyre, Jesus went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a man who was deaf and who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay hands on him. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be open. And immediately the man's ears were open, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well, and he even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
My dear faithful, the vivid image that is painted for us today of Jesus in the Gospel is one that was so dear to the early church that they took this episode and inserted it right into the liturgy of baptism. And it's one that is still there for us, that when a child or an adult is baptized, that the priest and those who are the one who is administering the baptism touches the ears of those to be baptized and touches their mouth, and prays the same prayer, Ephphatha, the same prayer of Christ, as a wonderful symbol of what takes place in the gospel today. And it is so dear to the early church and still to ourselves that it remains there and is one for us to reflect upon because of its importance, about it speaking about ourselves as well. Jesus returns to the region, and the faith of the crowd and the community there bring forward a man who is handicapped with a terrible handicap of not being able to speak and not being able to listen. And because he's deaf, obviously he has great difficulty in speaking and probably an impediment there as well. And it's nice to see the faith of the community that bring that person to Jesus so that he can lay hands on him because of what they've seen in the healing that he has done with so many other people handicapped and suffering from illness, and the empathy and the love that he has shown to them already. And what Jesus does, and obviously someone was a witness to this because it's such a strong testimony, is a great sign for us of the importance for Jesus also, but how important our listening is, how important our speech is, especially in relationship to the saving action of Jesus in our lives. He wishes us to hear his word. He wishes us to proclaim his word after we have taken it into our heart and made it our own. And those faculties missing in this man are an enormous handicap for him that Jesus, obviously in an emotional way, wishes to overcome right away. And Jesus takes him aside, almost maybe to respect his privacy, and away from the crowd, he touches with his hands, and this is something we see so often, that tactile nature of how Jesus ministers. And it fits what we'll speak about of his very incarnation itself. He uses his hands to touch the ears and the mouth, just as the priest does or the deacon does when they baptize a child, and prays the prayer, but before he does, looks to heaven and sighs. Sighs in prayer, almost with an emotion that becomes visible to the witness who sees this, that this is how important it is to Christ, this poor one who is unable even to listen to my words. And the reason maybe why this healing is so important, because it explains to us how important this ordinary step of listening to Christ's word and placing it in our hearts is for our formation and our salvation. And Christ, who has created every one of us, knows that this is the means he has chosen for us to gain salvation and communion with him, to listen to his words and to allow the miracle and mystery of listening to those words to enter into our very heart. No other creature can do that. Only humanity has been created in a way in which they can listen to the mystery of the gospel and the words of Christ, still alive in our church today, but also above all in Christ's preaching, to allow that to enter into their hearts so that Christ's desire to be enthroned in the souls of his faithful, so that he can rule and guide them, comes to fulfillment. It speaks of the fact that God has created us in such a way that almost naturally we're receptacles of his grace. And to see that, he has created us in a way that in a sense easily, when we overcome sin and we desire to listen to Christ's word, that we can receive the mystery of the gospel in our hearts. And yet it's still a mystery and a miracle how it happens. But it happens too frequently, and God risks too much in asking his church and his parents and his faithful community to continue to pass on this message, which it does faithfully, generation after generation, that we know that there is something miraculous taking place by the fact of how we're created, that we have a longing to listen to this message, that the gospel resonates in our hearts because it speaks of the very mysteries of who we are, what our relationship is with the divine, and who the divine is as he reveals himself in this world. Jesus touches and in many ways becomes born of the Virgin, becomes incarnate in his body, so that we can receive that continually even today. And Christ, distant, unable to touch our hearts or our ears or our mouths, continues to be present with us in the Eucharist. The same tactile desire that Christ has to be present, to lay hands on, to touch wounded places, to use his saliva, all these things reside still within us in what he has chosen for his communion with us in the Eucharist that we celebrate every Sunday and every day we come to Mass. And this is the gift that he has shown to us. He knows what we need. And in the midst of the darkness and difficulties of this world, receiving that message in our hearts then sends us out on the journey and pilgrimage of this life, living that faith in a world that often never recognizes it and sometimes is very hostile to it. And then we receive and need the grace to continue the journey, never losing heart and persevering to the end. But for ourselves today to see why this is so beautiful and so imaginative for Jesus in the image that he sends to us today. In the early church, they added an extra place where the priest touched those to be baptized. Not just the ears and the mouth, but also touched the nose. And touched the nose for the reason we spoke of all through Holy Week and Easter season, because of the fragrance of Christ's sanctity that resides in the church and that resides in the souls where Christ is enthroned. And when the faithful develop that sense of having a fragrance of the purity and sanctity of God, this is what the church wanted to say with the nose. Develop that faculty, which is the grace God will give, to know of the presence of God through the sacred purity of the fragrance of God himself in his sanctity among us. And we spoke at length about those kinds of things that develop among the faithful. This isn't part of our baptismal liturgy anymore, but it's so good for us to keep in mind, again, because of that tactile, physical nature of Christ's incarnation with us. And as we go forward today, hearing the gospel proclaimed for us at Mass today, listening to it and reflecting upon it for the rest of the day today and throughout the week, we know of Christ present among us. And having received that treasure in our hearts, imperfectly, every one of us, and yet desiring to believe more and more and more throughout our lives, he gives us the grace of his very body and blood, to give us the strength and the grace to go forward, to go out into the world, not only having listened to the words that he has spoken that now come into our hearts, but having the courage and the love and the kindness and the gentleness to speak his gospel as faithful servants and faithful instruments of his gospel.